Hello everyone, and welcome once again to Reading Culture. In the last video, we were introduced to the stories from the six worlds, right? Myth, legends by Whitehead. That is to say, compiled by her, in some cases rewritten, but all authentic myths. Today we're going to look at a specific one, so if you have the text, I would suggest that you turn to page 140. Where we will get the story that we are going to look at together. So the story begins that in the days of the old ones, there were giants in the forest. They were fierce, they were cruel. So note right off the bat this connection between the old ones, the forest and the giants. We talked in the last video about how the forest is this realm of kind of the ancient beginnings of man, but also of a kind of primordial chaos in a sense. And these giants, they are described as the cannibal giant persons. This association between cannibalism and giants is a very old one and exists in many mythologies. You see it in the Germanic mythology of the Old Norse. You see it in the classical Greek mythology and of the Romans as well. You see it in biblical mythology. Giants are often primordial, and they exist outside of the civilized realm. Again, they're often kind of the moors and in the forests and these kinds of areas where the normal social rules don't apply, where things like cannibalism, well, so we get the sense that they had the power. It says to kill and eat the people. Right? The old man is too old to hunt much anymore, so it is the business of his son to go out every day tracking people. He brings them to their camp, he kills them and guts them and brings them home to his father. Right? So this idea of cannibalism, it's indicative of being outside of the social bounds. Now we're going to see how these bounds try to become integrated. But we also get the sense that this is also coming from power, right? We talked about this in the last video, that this power capitalized with a P in this particular text, right, is indicative of this kind of force which allows people to, well, do various things that involve really kind of overcoming the normal natural bounds of people. But it's quite interesting that if we look at this kind of middle paragraph here, right? So it describes them, how he hauls their bodies home, mother cooks the flesh, right? And that they eat it in the wigwam, eating and talking and amusing themselves. And it says, just like any other living person. Well, that's kind of interesting. Right? They're compared to normal living persons, only they hunt men, not beasts. However, if we go on a little bit here, we see that as the son goes out hunting, right, he sees a young, beautiful woman. He sees her and he wants her, but he cannot kill her. He cannot tell his father where she is. So he follows her back to the wigwam and lies hidden in the brush all day long, watching her. So in other words, the hunt for food becomes a hunt for a wife. And this is very, very common in these stories, right? The hunt for a wife is a very much repeated trope. Something interesting happens. So he meets her parents, and it turns out that they're very old, and this young woman has to provide for them. But he decides that he will take that responsibility on. So this is now on page 142 here, where he says, I will hunt for you. So the relationship becomes reciprocal, right? They ultimately the parents give their consent to marry their daughter, and he provides them with food. Now, despite the fact that he becomes a hunter of animals, like a regular person, right? This isn't secret. He cannot tell his father. There's a sense that these two worlds are incompatible, but he's going to try and join them. But the world of cannibalism, right, in these forces, right, this power of cannibalism, is a danger to the world of the people for obvious reasons. The young man talks to his mother. He insists on having her. However, neither the sight nor smell of her must be present to the father. Either would be disastrous. Right, so now we're on page 143 now. So we get the sense that, he he hunts animals for the parents of, uh, well, it says here, this is at the page 143, the last sentence of the first paragraph. He's hunting animals for his wife's parents, but for his own parents, he is hunting people. So in other words, he is trying to occupy both worlds, hunting animals and people. That's very important. So he has a son, um, but the son has to learn quite quickly that his father, he keeps his food hanging in the wigwam, the stone wigwam. He keeps it in the stomach, in the intestines of a bear. He has like a little pouch, and no one must touch it. The food of these people, these giants who have the power of these cannibals, cannot be touched. His son is told by his mother he cannot fly one of his arrows in that direction, but he doesn't listen. And the container holding the food is penetrated by the son's arrow. And this loss of food results in a loss of power. This is at the bottom of 143. It says, out in the forest, right? The man knows what has happened. His power is draining away from him with every drop of oil leaking out of the bear's stomach. He's tiring, he is faint. When he finally reaches his wigwam, he has no appetite. He cannot eat. He blames his wife, but he doesn't say much to her. He just lies down. He just lies down and sleeps. This leads to quite a sudden reversal. On page 144, he says to his father, "You may have my wife for food." And in this shocking scene, particularly for us as modern readers, he then walks into the forest. Remember, the forest is a place of kind of chaos and peril and of primordial. It's the place of the cannibalistic giants, not towards the wigwam. His father goes there with a cane of iron. Also interesting. Ironmongery was not generally known prior to the European contact. So the fact that, but there's also this association with giants and metalworking, as we'll actually also see in Beowulf in a very different traditional context. The giant, the grandfather of the little boy, he engenders fear in his grandson, but his mother treats him with respect. And she begins to hunt lice. This may seem like a very kind of disgusting scene for us, but it's actually very common amongst pre-modern peoples that you would need to hunt your lice. But keep the imagery of the hunting in mind. So she doesn't notice the real danger, that someone is hunting her. Indeed, he's described as a hunter, the grandfather, as he puts his cane into the fire to get red hot. The child sees the real danger from his grandfather, but the mother doesn't listen. And ultimately, the grandfather kills the mother. It says he gets her like an animal. He takes her unborn child, which had been in her womb, and he is now seemingly aborted, and throws it into the water. But the story says the boy remains alive. Right? In other words, the grandfather doesn't kill his grandson, although he does all this in front of him. And upon his father's return, the boy tells his father the story. Now, interestingly, the father, despite the fact that he brings all of this about, tries to comfort him. This is at the bottom of page 144. "Do not cry," says his father, rocking him until he falls asleep. "Do not cry." But immediately after this, it says, his unborn child, cut from his mother, is floating in the water of the spring. So the aborted child floats in this water, but the turtle person holds it up to save it. And then, on page 145, the boy finds his brother, whom he thought dead, alive in the water, and they are reunited. The child, unborn, as he's referred to in the text, plays with his older brother, but he retreats to the water ere his father returns. Eventually, the child, unborn, enters the wigwam, but only in the absence of his father. The father sees evidence of the boy's playing, and upon inquiry, learns from his son that this little boy thrown in the water still lives, that he will not stay when he knows that his father approaches. So they come up with a plan to lure him in. The language used, and this is on page 145, is rather interesting. His son says, right, "I cannot get him to stay in the wigwam. He's wild. When he hears you coming, he jumps back into the water. But I have been thinking I'm thinking of a way to make him tame. Right? So you get this imagery of him almost like he's a beast that needs to be, like you need to break a horse or something, right? He needs to be tamed in some sense. Now, the father wants to know how, and they decide that they will tempt him with the tails of birds, brightly colored, that he will want to play with. So they trap him. And on page 146, we see him put feather after feather in the fire, but only the heron's feather avoids the fire. It accepts him in. Now, if you read some of the other stories in the collection, you'll see that the heron has a particularly important place. But we can't quite get into that here. The main thing is just to note that he is ultimately accepted in. And it's very interesting. First, we get the reaction of the father. It says his father loves him. He has given him his heart. He brings all sorts of nice little things to play with. And we learn that this boy, he has power with a capital P. He is growing very fast, faster than a boy of the people would grow. Right? He asked his father to make him a bow, but he is now so strong that the bow his father makes breaks when he bends it back. So he has to make one for himself. He's 10 times as strong as any bow a man of the people could bend. So we see this very common trope in mythology of, we could call it the hero, or we could call it something else, but that, right, there, not only that he's stronger than normal people, that's a common trope, it's also very common, you see in Celtic mythology and many other mythologies, of growing faster, right? So even though he would just be a little boy, he's growing exponentially, you can imagine. But then one day, he tells his brother, he says that our father gave our mother to our grandfather to kill. So they grab some birch bark, and child unborn, the younger brother, he grabs a stone from the spring, where he, as an unborn child, was cast. It's very important. Remember, in the last video, we were talking about objects of power. This power doesn't just reside in individuals, it's also related to objects. And they await their father's return. He senses the danger of this birch. They could catch fire, but he only sees the danger of an accidental fire, not a deliberate one. The little boy, the younger brother, the child unborn, he provokes his father to look for lice, just as had happened to his mother. His father hunts the lice, and wearied from his hunting, he falls asleep. Interestingly, keep this in mind, the number 3, thrice they circle the wigwam, and then the stone from the spring where he was cast is used to block the entrance. They set it alight. As it burns and collapses around him, as our father is burning alive, he's concerned that his older son saved the younger one. It's kind of interesting. Why, after all he's done, would he be concerned for his life now? When it's all over, the boys gather up the ashes. The younger brother, the child unborn, grinds up his father's bones with a stone, this very stone from the spring, a very object of power, and the powder transforms into other forms of life. Mosquitoes, sandflies. Remember, in this world, right, things are constantly shifting, everything is fluid, right? So the life doesn't just end when he dies, it turns into other forms of life. But ultimately, it's dust. It says their father is, this is on page 147, their father is dust blowing. There's nothing left of him but flies. Again, one thinks in the Western tradition, the Christian tradition, that ashes to ashes, dust to dust at funerals. From dust you were made, and from dust you will return. There's a sense of this cyclical nature of life. So the first half of this really is a revenge narrative is at an end. Now, the grandfather awaits revenge. So they begin the next stage of their journey. We get little episodes on page 148. We learn the origin of the lines in birch bark. Ultimately, they set their plan in motion. They kill a moose for a trap. Right? They tell their grandfather about this moose. And ultimately they are in the wigwam with him. Once again, the child unborn provokes, and this time his grandfather, to hunt for lice. Once again, this hunt for lice, just as with his mother, is repeated. And just as with his father, it is followed by sleep, exhaustion from the hunt. They take the flesh of the kill, the moose, apply it over his face, and light the fat on fire. They roast his liver, a very important part of the body symbolically, and they bring it to the grandmother. She's given the liver to eat. Right, again, we see this in many myths. You see it in Germanic myths, the idea of feeding up a family member in some horrible fit of revenge. Now, it's difficult to read tone into these stories, of course. What may seem amusing to us may not necessarily be so in its original conception. So when the grandmother is informed that she has eaten the liver of her husband, and she says, this is on page 148, my poor old man, still, he had a very sweet liver. It's not clear if that's meant to be a joke. Certainly, the moral world in which we are living in, when we try and inhabit this tale, is a very different one than we might imagine. But one thing that is clear, and this is on page 149, we are made clear that we're supposed to see the grandmother as culpable, at least from the point of view of the brothers. This is right. This is at the bottom of 148. Right, the younger brother says, "You ate my mother. Now you can eat the one who killed her." And then he kills her himself. And then he follows up with the next and final stage, that leads to the revenge drama. They're going to kill them all of them, all of the cannibalistic giants. They all must die. However, on the way, they have a little adventure where the very waters are against them. Everything is dried up. They need to drink. They're strangers in this place. And the bullfrog person, he's stolen, trapped all the waters. And he's only giving out water in exchange for women. Right, all they're left with is half full vessels of water, or dirty water, which goes to the grandson. So they head off to the bullfrog person. It seems that he has a verifiable harem in there. But ultimately, we see the power of the younger brother, of the child unborn, his superhuman strength. And he frees water for all the people. And we learn the origin of the bullfrog's back. But what we're seeing here is a very common trope. Again, the strength of this person. And it's interesting because the strength is used for his own personal revenge, but he's also now using it to help people. Again, is this a kind of manifestation of what we would think of as the typical strongman hero? He makes a bow for himself that will not break. Now, on page 151, it becomes clear that this bow is used by means of his power, again, with a capital P. It's by means of that he can shoot it. And he uses it to kill a giant, a notable feat. To destroy a giant's weir, by which he catches his fish. And the giant, out of a kind of irrational rage, kills his own family, all of them, out of his own anger, and kills himself. And in what could, by modern perception, seem somewhat anticlimactic, this is how it ends. All the giants are dead, and the boys are revenged. And that's the end of the main part of the plot. Now, the story goes on, and is much more difficult for us to deal with. We see all kinds of manifestations of the power after this. The elder brother dies in the heat of a fire in the wigwam of a porcupine person. But the younger brother, he revives his dead brother. He's able to silence animals. This power, right, is visible to other people. They realize that he has it. And others have it as well. But again, he's constantly able to overcome these kinds of aspects of nature. So his younger brother dies again. This time he freezes. So first he's too hot, then he's too cold. Again, his brother revives him. They find themselves ultimately deep in the forest. Remember, the same place where their father and grandfather, who they have slain, originated from. There are others in this forest who have the power to revive the dead. They go on many more quests. They hunt loons and whales. They re-enter the forest. They have encounters with growing beaver skins, with skunk women, who leaves the child unborn to die on an island. But he calls the gulls to him and frees himself. He overcomes the stench of their odor in a scene which is very difficult to not be humorous to us, but probably wasn't meant to be. We also see his cleverness, right? They try and outsmart him. We see the repetition of these things in threes. So the skunk woman tries to kill him 3 ways and fails. Then they travel 3 days to the north. And we get the final kind of episode, which is very, very strange for us. They kill an unknown person, and then they find his family, throw the body down at them, and snakes come out of their face. Again, this idea of fluidity. There's not a clear definition and boundary between animal and person at all times. And finally, it ends, perhaps even more strangely than it began. It says this in the final paragraph. They go away from the place where they encountered these snake-faced people. They find their canoe and they paddle to an island. Here there's a camp of the people. Here they are living for many years. And these 2 brothers, they grow so old that they turn into stone. And that is the last that is told about them. Remember at the beginning of our discussion in the last video, I talked about how almost everything is numinous, almost everything is infused with kind of power and life transforms, that even rocks may speak. So here we have another transformation, perhaps almost as the ashes of the dust of the bones ground with the rock from the spring turn into mosquitoes. So they have another transformation. They turn into a kind of living edifice, a living rock. This has been a very brief look at what is a very difficult, perhaps, and complex tale. But if you approach it as a narrative, right, you have a clear story, a clear narrative, and really a clear revenge story, at least perhaps until the last episode, right, with this child unborn ultimately revenging himself for the death of his mother, on his father, his grandfather, and this whole race of cannibalistic giants that are hunting people like animals. And if you focus on that, you may be able to keep your bearings amongst what perhaps is in the surrounding structure a very, very difficult world in which to try and enter. But ask this question: is the child unborn a hero in any of the senses in which we are familiar with the term? If so, how would we define that heroism? It doesn't have to be moral, but it does have to be meaningful.